Okay, so let's start. Thank you everyone for coming to this seminar. It's a pleasure to introduce you Francesca Johnson. She had a degree, a bachelor in biotechnology from the University of Padova, and then he did some master in neuroscience from between Göttingen and Bordeaux. But then she did a second master at here in Palma de Mallorca at IFISC, the master in physics of complex systems in 2015-2016, and she did the master thesis with Amia and myself on pattern formation in clonal plants. And after this, she moved again to neuroscience. She moved to SISA in Trieste, Italy, where she has been doing her PhD until last summer. She read the thesis with a title that is Memories, Attractors, Space, and Vowels. So this is the thesis, and the supervisor was Alessandro Treves from SISA. And she has worked in several aspects of memory and learning. So then she will talk about this today. So it's a pleasure to have you here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. So I will switch off my camera just for to be safe for the connections, but if you have any questions or interrupt me, I will switch it on again. So, okay. So thank you very much for offering me this possibility of giving the seminar, in which I will briefly present the background and the results of two of the projects I carried on during the PhD. And these studies were developed under the supervision of Alessandro Treves and in collaboration with Remy Monasson and Yasser Rudi. So generally, in this presentation, I will talk about memory in the brain and how we make sense of it from a theoretical point of view. So for the beauty of looking at the scientific timeline, let me jump briefly at the beginnings. So in my field, memory is usually traced back the study of memory to Hermann Ebbinghaus at the end of the 19th century. But while writing the PhD thesis, I had the pleasure of getting to know that contemporary to Ebbinghaus, but on the other side of the world, Mary Calkins was pursuing her innovative studies of memory, which led her to handle a PhD dissertation of memory to Harvard, but which was never accepted as she was a woman. From those days of excitement in the newborn psychology community to the work I will present in those days, there have been fundamental steps like those sketched on the line, and a fundamental turning point, which is when theoretical models came to the fore, from Marr's simple memory model to the Hopfield network. And in particular, when Amit, Goodfriend, and Sompolinsky realized that the tools of statistical mechanics and spin glasses could be applied to the study of neural networks, thus opening the doors and walking the first fundamental steps into the possibility of using formulas and physics to understand neuronal dynamics. Since then, memories are regarded as attractors, discrete or continuous one. Discrete attractors are normally intended to model separate memories, whereas continuous attractor to model the memorization of continuous variable. Attractors, as you all know, are complex mathematical objects. However, one can get a simple intuition of what they mean in neuronal populations. So, as we know, the brain is composed by neurons. They are the fundamental cells of the brain, which are interconnected in networks and subnetworks, and which can be active or inactive. So in a neuronal population, an attractor is intended as a configuration of activity towards which the neuronal population tends to evolve and stabilize in time. If we imagine the space of all possible memories as this plane, then those memories which are stored are those at the bottom of the valley, and the dynamics of the neuronal population can be sketched as the ball sliding on this plane. For continuous attractor, the bottom of those valleys is not a unique point, but it's a continuous set of fixed points, and the dynamics reach it as from the arrow on the ball. There is an alternative schematic of continuous attractor, which I will introduce later, and this. So the fact is that to make analytical predictions and calculations using those models, one normally needs to make some assumptions about homogeneity and symmetry in the memories. However, real world is complex, full of correlations and irregularity. And here is where the project I carried on starts from. In particular, we asked, what would be the way in which neuronal populations may self-organize to store irregular and complex memories? We tried to approach this question from two interconnected itineraries. At first, we somehow asked the opposite. So we asked what would be the maximal number of memory that a neuronal population would be able to store if it would be optimally connected as compared to a neuronal population biologically connected. One may ask why we took this strange path. Well, the fact is that in order to get to a mathematical intuition, to a mathematical response to the question we posed, there is a barricade of challenges which one needs to be able to overcome. And if not possible because of mathematical problem, one can take an interconnected itinerary and hope to get to a broader view at the end. This is somehow what we did. And we saw that neuronal populations which are realistically connected can reach to a storage capacity which is higher than that which can be obtained with optimal algorithm. And this is true only when neurons are considered to be allowed to have different firing rate and not be just binary. These results somehow highlights the fundamental role of the firing rate of neurons in coding in the neuronal populations. This is visible in the experimental results which moved the second projects of the thesis, and they are in the domain of spatial memories, in particular of place cells. And for those who are not familiar, I will introduce them later. In this case, we saw that place cells recorded in recent experimental settings more similar to the wild nature in which the animals are normally living are very irregular, and they fail to be described by a continuous attractor. We see, however, that there is another mathematical object that emerges as soon as continuous attractor break, and it's which we call continuous quasi-attractor, and these are persistent direction of flow, which breaks with a phase transition at a certain critical level of noise. So this leads us to hypothesize that spatial memories may be encoded in the brain by continuous quasi-attractors. So in the first project is mostly related to discrete attractors, whereas the second one to continuous attractor. So now, after this long introduction, let me jump from one project to the other. The first study was done in collaboration with Yasser Rudi in Trondheim, and you can find more about it at this reference. So the storage capacity, what I mentioned as the maximal number of memories which a network of neurons can store, is a well-defined quantity in statistical mechanics, and it's normally defined as the maximal number of patterns or memory which can be stored divided by the size of the network, and it's defined as this alpha critical. There are some fundamental building blocks of the neural networks which I will introduce in order to describe the results. So a pattern or a memory, mu, in a network of, for example, 4 neurons, is defined by the activity values that, for example, in the memory mu equal to 1, those 4 different units have. In this case, they are, for example, measured in hertz. A second fundamental building block is the connectivity matrix. So those neurons are connected among each other, and the connections, the strength of the connections tends to resemble what is occurring in the real synapses in the brain. So when we consider a pattern to be stored, it means that the dynamical evolution of this network goes towards a fixed point. And when we want to evaluate the storage capacity, we evaluate how many of those fixed points can be stored. Somehow, how many of the valley can be shaped in that plane which I showed before. For this, there are two fundamental quantities that define the dynamics. One is the transfer function. The transfer function somehow tells us what does a new neuron do with all the inputs it receives. One can say that the neurons get active or inactive, so a binary transfer function. Or one can say that it is inactive up to a certain level of input, and then it increases linearly the firing rate. There are also many more possibilities which are even more realistic, but I'm focusing on those two because they are the ones which one can treat analytically. So in the in the pioneering studies which were used in neuronal networks, but also in spin glasses, one normally assumes binary units, but the neurons in the brain are not binary. And there are some evidences that they have a threshold linear dependency with the strength of the input. The second relevant quantity is how the connections are learned in the network. So how the synapses are learned. Biologically, we know that connections are usually stronger the more two neurons are active together. That's what is normally known as Hebbian learning. It is biologically plausible and it is one shot. So at each step, the connections can change depending just on the activity value of the units. Here, for those who are familiar, there are the formulation for binary and threshold linear units, and one sees that the connections between neuron I and J increases the more neuron I and neuron J are active at the same time. But then there is a second possibility, which is optimal learning. So optimal learning, or iterative perceptron backpropagation learning, is that which is used in machine learning strategies or deep neural network algorithm. And the connections are optimized thanks to the backpropagation of errors. So the pioneering studies in neural networks have evaluated the maximal storage capacity for binary units using realistic learning, so Hebbian learning, and optimal learning, and consolidated the impression that optimal learning is can reach way higher capacity than when connections are one-shot, non-iterative, and biologically inspired. The results for threshold linear units, so those which are resembling more neuronal behavior, were instead derived only for Hebbian learning. And we asked what would happen connecting those units in an optimal way. We did so by applying the mathematical intuitions of Elizabeth Gardner, which she envisaged for binary units. In particular, she evaluated the fractional volume of the interaction space, which enabled to satisfy the storage of a number of patterns. And then she took the limit in which this number of patterns is maximal. In particular, the idea is that this fractional volume of the interaction space shrinks the more patterns needs to be stored. And when it shrinks to a single point, then the maximal, the upper bound of the storage capacity is reached. So we formulated the same for threshold linear units, and then developed the calculation starting from this fractional volume. As the volume is a non-self-averaging quantity, we need to evaluate the logarithm and take the replica in order to evaluate the average. So the replica method basically enables to calculate the average of the logarithm as the average of n replicas of that volume. Those replicas are replicas which are identical apart from the quench variables, and the quench variables in this case are the weights. So developing the calculations, which we are not entering into the detail now, we reached to two order parameters. In particular, the whole trick, which Elizabeth Gardner envisaged, is that these second order parameters, which pop up also in the binary case, goes to 1 when we are at the maximal storage capacity, as there is only one configuration of connections which enables to store that number of patterns. So the replica A and B are equal, and then we reach to this Q value going to 1. So doing the same, taking this limit and then the limit of the replicas going to 0, we reach to the final formulation of the storage capacity for a network of neurons which are grade threshold linear and which are optimally connected. So by comparing those results, here there are just the definitions of those parameters, but basically this storage capacity only depends on the fraction of active units in the stored pattern. So if we compare those results with that obtained with Hebbian learning, we can see the difference between the two storage capacity. So in this slide, just want to show that in the Hebbian learning case, those calculations developed in the 90s, the storage capacity does depend on the distribution of distribution of activities in the memory, whereas in our calculation it does not, and that we can compare the two calculations by these A and F parameters, which define the sparsity of the memory and the fraction of active units. Okay, so if we look at, if we plot the storage capacity for some sample distribution like binary, ternary, quaternary, then we obtain the following results. So in the x-axis, we are plotting the fraction of active units in the pattern, whereas in the y-axis, the storage capacity. The solid line here is the result we obtained analytically of the optimal storage capacity, which does not depend on the distribution. The color symbols inside are the results we estimated numerically, setting up a backpropagation graded descent algorithm to validate our analytical prediction. Instead, the dashed lines are those results previously obtained when the learning rule is biologically plausible, which do depend on the distribution. Okay, so in this, one can see that depending on the distribution of the stored pattern, the optimal bound can be surpassed for a certain fraction of active units. So how does this happen? So this is together a violation and a non-violation. It is a violation of the upper bound, an apparent violation of the upper bound, because there are fundamental differences in the way the storage capacity is calculated for biologically plausible network or for the optimally connected network. Optimal learning in particular assumes that the retrieved memories are identical to the stored ones, whereas Hebbian learning assumes that the network self-organizes and retrieve the memories with some errors, provided, however, that the overlap with one single retrieved memory is way higher than the overlap with all the rest of the memories which are stored. So this is the reason, because it is an apparent violation, but it is a non-apparent violation because this difference in the calculation strategy is present also for binary units. But in that case, the upper bound can never be surpassed, the optimal capacity can never be surpassed by Hebbian learning. So what is the type of errors which are introduced in the retrieved memories obtained by Hebbian learning? We see that Hebbian learning self-organizes to retrieve memory which are sparser than the stored ones. So on the y-axis on this plot, you can see the ratio of a quantity, which defines the sparsity of the code. Somehow it says how active the units are between, and this ratio is between the stored and the retrieved memories. So the retrieved memory have a lower sparsity as compared to the stored ones. So this is telling us that when units are connected with Hebbian learning, then the storage leads to retrieve memories which are way sparser. When we apply this to some sample neuronal recordings, for example, those two, and we plot what would be the histogram of the distribution of the activities in the retrieved memories, you can see that is way sparser. So there are more units which are silent in the retrieved memories as compared to the stored ones. Okay, so wrapping up a bit this first part, what we see is that there was a consolidated consensus that optimal learning would lead to way higher capacity as compared to Hebbian learning. And this impression was consolidated also by the results in machine learning as compared to what the brain could achieve. But fundamentally, these results are obtained considering binary units, whereas neurons in the brain are non-binary, and better but still mathematically simple description is a threshold linear dependency. So in this case, if we consider both unit which are neuronal-like and a learning which is biologically plausible, we see that the brain is actually quite efficient, and it does it by retrieving memory. It does it at the cost of reducing the sparsity of the retrieved memories. So the role, perhaps fundamental in the brain, of the variability in the firing rate of neurons is highlighted also in the experimental evidences which move the second part of the works which I'm presenting, and which are in the field of spatial memories. This work is done in collaboration with Rémi Monasson à l'École Normale in Paris. So here we are shifting from discrete attractors to spatial memories. So that field which is asking, how do we memorize an environment? So a continuous variable, which is the space. To this question, Tolman, 72 years ago, proposed that animals as well as humans create cognitive maps of an environment. And John O'Keefe, about 50 years ago, discovered what is considered the first neurophysiological validation of this hypothesis. He discovered a place cells, which led him to the half of the Nobel Prize in 2014. Maybe here, not everyone is familiar to what a place cell is, so let me introduce it. So imagine that you can record the activity values of some cells in the brain of an animal, for example, a rat, when this animal is alive and living his life. So you are able to know what is the activity value of specific neurons which you are recording of this animal at each time. So here I'm showing some real recordings from the Kentros lab, where they are recording one place cells of a rat, which is depicted as a blue dot just for the sake of visualization, but they are real recording. And the path which is walked by the animal is depicted as a black trace. So while the animal is walking, they are recording the activity of some of its place cells. Here it's shown only one. In particular, the red dots are the positions at which that specific cell is getting activated while the animal is walking around. So you can see that when the animal is passing in the upper right corner, the cell is getting activated. Otherwise, it's mostly silent. Okay, so at the end of this recording section, for example, we would see a specific position in space where that recorded cell of the animal is preferentially active. And that's what we call the place field of that cell. And that cell, we consider it to be a spatially selective cell. So in these alternative plots, which is normally showing a place cell, you can see the firing rate map. So the blue area is the area where the cell is almost never active, whereas the red area where the firing rate of that cell is mostly active. Since then, many other spatially selective cells have been discovered, like head direction cells, which are preferentially active when the animal is moving the head, border cell, grid cell, which those who discovered grid cell won the other half of the Nobel Prize, and speed cell. But here, let me focus just on place cells. In the rest of the presentation, we will focus just on place cells. So place cells in the recording settings, which were normally used at the beginnings, which were small cages of 1.5 meters, usually had just a unique field. And here you can find some other examples of place cells. This consolidated the impression that place fields are singular, always singular, and that each place cells can be thought as having one field identical to the other, or to the one of another place cells, but just in a different position. This assumption was fundamental and was not far from the real recordings, and was fundamental for formulating the theory based on which place cells can be described as being encoded in a continuous attractor, in which in each position at the valley of the attractor, there is the population activity of all the neurons, and each position represents one position in space. But how do those cells behave in the larger environments in which the animals which are used are normally used and adapted to live? Well, in the past years, experimental results and recordings in larger settings have shown that place fields are not regular. These are some results from larger settings and recordings in rats in 2 and 1 dimension. And then in particular, recent results, which is crucial for the model I will present later, show that bats flying in a 200-meter long track have highly regular place field. So here I'm presenting the results of 2 cells. In orange is the place fields in one direction, and in blue on the other direction. And you see that among these 2 cells, there is a high difference, and that the place fields can have different shape, different peak height, and a different number per cell. So this irregularity and in these place maps is so high that it doesn't enable a continuous attractor to emerge. And this is where our work starts. So to understand how a continuous attractor theory may contemplate such irregularity. So to go further, let me introduce a few ways of visualizing a continuous attractor, which will be useful. So continuous attractor, in the absence of noise, so imagine there are different fields which are all the same, can be intended, for example, in one dimension, if you close the extremities, as a ring attractor. And this can be visualized in two ways. So these bumps can be considered activity or overlap bumps. So if it is an activity bump, then you can imagine that at each position on the ring, you are placing one cell, and the closer two cells are together, the stronger is their connection. In that case, the dynamics will lead to the emergence of a bump of activity centered on one or the other cell. An alternative visualization, which coincides with the first one in the case of full regularity, is that at each position on this red circle that now would represent the energy, you place the activity value of all the units in that specific position. And then you can calculate what is the overlap with each position of a certain configuration of the fixed point. In that case, if it is centered over one or the other position, it means that the animal, for example, is in that location. Okay, these two visualizations is common not to fully grasp them at the first try, but they are just useful for the representation of the results, which I will introduce in a moment. So going back to the fact that the place maps are irregular, what was known about the behavior of continuous attractor with noise? Well, continuous attractors are very brittle objects, and in particular, they have different responses to fast noise and quench noise. In the case of fast noise, what one sees is that the bump of activity slides on the manifold because all the positions have equal energy. So this is problematic in the case of neuronal populations, as there is a lot of neuronal noise. But there were studies showing that there can be some biologically plausible mechanism to maintain the bump still. But another source of noise, which is the most problematic, is quench noise. Quench noise is that which in this case comes from the irregularity of the maps. It is that noise which transfers in the connectivity matrix and breaks the geometry and the regularity in the connections. If you imagine indeed to have equal place fields and that each connection is strengthened the more two fields are active together, then if they are perfectly regular, you get a perfect ring attractor. But if they are irregular, then this attractor breaks and there are just a few fixed points which remain stable. When this irregularity is low, however, one can still consider, and that was the general consensus, that this model would still be well describable by a continuous attractor, being semi-continuous. However, the scenario changes when the irregularity in the fields is very high, like that which is observed in experiments. In this context, the variability in the fields acts as a strong source of quench noise, completely breaking the continuous attractor, and the number of residual fixed points becomes very low. However, what we see is that when this continuous attractor breaks, it gives rise to a new object, which is a direction of flow. In other words, the bumps, in order to reach the fixed point, slide on the manifold to reach the final configuration. And they do it even when the quench noise is very high. This occurs, however, up to a certain critical level of variability at which this direction of flow breaks through a phase transition. And even if the fixed points are still on the manifold, they are not reached through the manifold. So somehow here I'm resuming the results which I will present, but how did we get to these results? So inspired by the recordings, we generated a continuous representation of the firing rate of neurons, and in particular, we create a data we create an algorithm for data generation in which the variability of the fields is parameterized by this standard deviation value of the log normal distribution from which they are taken. And here is the results of the algorithm generation, the data generation. On the first line, it's experimental results, and on the second line, the distribution we constructed, we generate, and they are similar. Then we set the connections between the unit through Hebbian learning. So instead of saying now that the more two units are active together in time, we say the more two units are active together in space, the stronger is their connection, which is the same thing. And then once set the network structure, we run neuronal dynamics and explore systematically what happens. So note that this system is well describable also through an energy function. Okay, so what we see is that if we ask the network to store a certain level of variability parameterized by this sigma d, so the fields of each cell are not so different one from each other, then we see that the bump of activity slides on the manifold. So here it's a bump of activity that starts at this position, and then during the evolution from gray to black, it stops at the fixed point, which is lying close by. And here it's a zoom in. Instead, when the network is asked to store patterns which have a higher level of variability, when starting from a certain position on the manifold, then the overlap with all the position decreases during the evolution and then recreates in a different position. And this can be also seen by the standard deviation of the bump during the evolution. Okay, so what we call quasi-attractive continuous manifold is this regime where the bump is sliding over the manifold, which became a direction of flow. Okay, so now if we consider the percentage of vanished manifold as all those positions on the manifold over which the bump is not sliding anymore, we see that this percentage of vanished manifold increases at a certain level of variability in the field diameters parameterized by this sigma d. And the steepness of this transition increases with the system size as happening with the phase transitions. And this does not relate to the number of fixed points, of residual fixed points of the manifold, which is smoothly decreasing. An alternative way of seeing this is if we evaluate the direction of the eigenvectors corresponding to the smallest eigenvalue of all the residual fixed points. So in other words, if we calculate in which direction a fixed point would stabilize if it would not be fixed point anymore due to some more noise. So if we compare this direction of the eigenvector corresponding to the smallest eigenvalue to the direction of the manifold, we see that up to a certain level of noise, this direction is aligned with the manifold, and then the alignment decreased drastically. So somehow this tells us that the fixed point before this critical level of noise would become points at which the bump would slide over them. Instead, after this critical level, this would break, and they would become points over which the bump would not slide. So if we now look at the phase space, also not only for variable diameters, but also of the fields, but also for variable peak height, we would see that there are 2 phases and 3 in the case of which the mean number of fields zeta is higher. And here the white cross is the experimental distribution. So these measures are better visible in this schematic of the phase diagram, which I'm plotting here. So we see that there are 3 phases. One phase, which we call continuous quasi-attractor, which is when the manifold, which is broken because there is noise, persists as a flow direction. Then there is a phase where the fixed points are still localized on the manifold, but are not reached through the manifold but are not reached through the manifold. And then there is a third phase where the fixed points do not seem to be localized. And this phase emerges only when the regularity is very high and the regularity in the number of fields, but not in the peak firing rate and in the dimension. Okay, so this boundary is what we are now trying to find with a theoretical approach. And in particular, we saw that this system can be extremely simplified. And if we consider only one field per unit, and we bin this dimension, the diameter dimension, into separate bins, then we see that this transition that we have observed only in the dynamics, and which is relevant in the dynamics, can be actually visualized also in the fixed points. And in particular, we see that those fixed points after the transition are composed only by the units which belong to the bin composed by the higher diameters, so that only those units which are more active on the space remain active and the rest are somehow discarded. So somehow there is a certain level of noise which is tolerated, after which the fields which are more active dominate all the scenes. And we are currently trying to understand how we can treat this analytically and make an analytical model. And here in the last plots, you see 3 examples of fixed points for different sigma d values. And you see that for before the transition, there are units which are active belonging to all the different bins, whereas after the transition, only those which are more active, which have larger fields, remain active. Okay, so wrapping up these results, we know that there are spatially selective cells and that normally they were well described through a continuous attractor, as it was a general consensus that place fields, for example, had only a unique field. Any source of noise in the recordings were usually considered as perturbation of this continuous attractor, and the model were brought back as a description of a regular standard continuous attractor. However, with recordings in larger environmental settings more similar to the nature, people, which can be highly variable, it's not possible to bring back the regularity to a standard continuous attractor. We see, however, that irregular place fields act on continuous attractor as quench noise, and they give rise to a new object, which is a direction of flow. So if, and that these irregular place maps may be effectively memorized in this quasi-continuous attractive manifold. So if the maps are precisely regular, then the standard continuous attractor is retrieved. But if the maps are irregular, the memory function is still preserved because it's not anymore considered as the continuity of the fixed point, but the continuity of the flow. And we observe that Bach's recordings lie just at the edge, which are notable for being the most variable recordings of place cells, lie just at the edge of this transition. And at the moment, we are currently attempting to find the boundaries of those different phases analytically in collaboration with Rémi Monasson. Okay, so the studies which I presented in this seminar, which there is still time for questions, aimed at providing some new ideas and a better understanding of how neuronal populations may self-organize with their simple rules in order to give rise to complex capabilities such as the storage of irregular maps. And in particular, how attractor dynamics and attractor neural networks can include irregularities, complexity, and dishomogeneity of the external world in their formulation. And I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Francesca. So now it's time for questions. Any of you can unmute yourself and ask some question. Damian, you want to ask?
Yeah, well, I have one.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for the talk, Francesca. It's a rather general question, actually. One thing, I don't understand, or if I'm not sure I've understood properly, is that the models So you have these dynamics that follow a potential, and the minimums are will be the attractors that are the memories. So there are so there are not time dependent. No, so I mean the dynamics of the variables have no input, correct? No external input.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes,
So
they have no external input. So
you assume somehow let's say a structure of the brain or whatever, which is fixed, no?
Yeah.
And then I don't know, maybe I'm saying a silly thing, but so the idea of a memory sometimes is that you recall the memory when you receive an input, no? That's how the neural
exactly
work.
Yes.
So, and is this in the models? Is not really there, or could you introduce that effect there too, or?
Yeah, so we are queuing the memories. You're right. So the dynamics don't have a persistent external input, but we are fixing the mean activity, for example, while the dynamics is evolving. So it's a recurrent dynamics given just by the connections, like some subnetworks that there are in the brain. But we are fixing, otherwise the activity values would go to 0. The way in which we are queuing a particular memory is by starting the dynamics from a position which is very close to that, from a configuration which is close to that memory. And then, for example, this is in the case, in the second case, we are starting the dynamics from the manifold, and then we are looking if they remain on the manifold. This is the way in which it's done numerically. Instead, for the analytical part, now for the second part, we didn't really figure out the analytics yet, but for the first part, it's a mean field approach, and you assume that this memory can be retrieved, but you don't, if you would need to make it numerically, you would start from the same memory, from that same pattern, and look if it's stable or not.
Okay. I think so. So I mean that. So simply you assume that the external input, what it does is place your initial condition at some place near that.
Yeah, there are. I mean, numerically in this field, people use also different strategies. You can make the external input to be persistent, and then to look if it's leading the network towards that fixed point. But what we are interested in is the recurrent dynamics. So we don't, because a strong enough external input would always fix you to a certain fixed point. So we look at the evolution, and the trick is to start from that same fixed point and look if it remains or if the dynamics makes it deviating away.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Damian. More questions? Just unmute yourself. I have myself a question. In the first part, you have mentioned that this theoretical limit of optimal learning can be surpassed, can be improved if you allow some errors in the recovery of the memories.
Yes.
And then you say that these errors were related to variability in the firing rates. But I haven't got the relationship between the two things, the errors in the table and the firing rates. Could you explain a little bit more?
Yes, of course. Okay, so when in the calculations that assume Hebbian learning and not optimal learning, okay, the mean field is developed such that you look at one single pattern and you look at the overlap of the retrieve state with that single pattern is much higher than the overlap with all the rest of the patterns. Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, so this is the way in which it is developed, but then one can calculate how is the activity in the, okay, here we don't enter into the formulas, but how it is the activity values in the retrieved states as compared to the stored state. So let's say we have a memory which wants to, in a small network, which is 1, 1, 1, 1, 1. And then in the retrieve state is 0.5, 0.5, 0.5. Okay. this is a very silly example, but then we would be able to compare how active are the neurons in the retrieved as compared to the memory which we ask the network to store. And we see that even if provided that still the network is retrieving a particular memory, because the pattern which is retrieved has a way higher overlap with that single memory and not with all the rest, this memory is different from the stored pattern. And in particular, the units are less active than what they not as in my example, which are constantly all of them less active, but in a particular form which is given by the self-organization of disabled learning, given by disabled learning. So they are retrieved in a sparser version, and this is possible only when the units are non-binary, because if they are binary, there is no chances of changing the sparsity parameter, which is always equal to the average of the network.
Okay, so you are interpreting the thing in the mathematical description, the average activity is a number, then you assume that it comes from the biology of neurons firing at different rates. The faster you fire, the higher is the activity. Is this the mapping between the two things?
Yes, so the sparsity itself is defined as the square of the average of the activity divided by the average of the squares of the activities. And we assume that the higher is this average, like this value is somehow giving a measurement of how active is the whole population.
Okay, good. Thank you. More questions? Any more questions? I don't see anyone unmuted. So
maybe it was a bit fast.
No. Okay. So if there are no more questions, no, it's Daniel, but you say that before. No, okay. No. So do you want to say something or? No, I'm done. Thank you. So if there are no more questions, then let's thank again Francesca for this talk. And okay, that's the end. So thank you everyone for coming. And Francesca, thank you for coming, and see you next time. Hopefully in person. Okay. Sure. Goodbye. Goodbye.
Thank you very much to everyone for the possibility.
Yeah.
Thank you, Francesca.
Bye bye.
Bye, Francesca.
Bye bye.